Hi, everyone. Thank you for listening to me. My research question is about the structural and functional differences in brain development identity and their impact on mental health experiences associated with gender. Oh, and my name's Hasini. So, a bit about me is I already said my name's Hasini. I live in San Diego. I'm a junior. I like eating food, I like listening to music, and I like opening blind box toys. So, the how I ended up with my research question or what inspired me is that I had a lot of friends around me that were identifying with different identities and genders, and I'd often hear a lot of talk about it being a choice or these people don't actually identify that way or they weren't meant to be that way, but they had a mental health disorder before, and that previous mental health disorder made them act this way. So I just wanted to investigate and research more on this to understand the people around me and maybe create a bit more compassion. So the main purpose is to understand biological reasons and environmental factors and mental health implications in trans and non-binary individual. My research asks how structure and functional differences in the brain contribute to mental health outcomes for individuals with gender diverse gender identities. I'm especially interested in understanding whether these differences are biological, environmental, or both, and how they intersect with lived experiences. I'm first going to go over historical content of gender identity and in mental health. So, the classification of gender identity has changed significantly over time. In 1980, the DSM-3 introduced transsexualism as a psychosexual disorder. In 1994, the term shifted to gender identity disorder, which was a small step towards destigmatization. Then in 2013, the DSM-5 volume introduced gender dysphoria, which marked a pivotal change. It emphasized the emotional distress rather than the implied disordered identity. Around the same time, the World Health Organization also updated its views. In 1990, the ICD-10 listed transsexualism as a mental disorder, but then in 2019, it changed and reclassified under sexual health, not psychiatry. This showed a growing recognition of gender diversity as a part of humanitarian variation, not pathology. There are a lot of barriers to affirming care in the past versus now, and I'm going to explain why it's significant. Historically, trans and non binary individuals face significant barriers when trying to access gender affirming care. Under the older gatekeeping model, mental health professionals were placed in the position of deciding whether someone was trans enough to receive hormones or surgery. This often involved undergoing multiple psychological evaluations and a requirement to live full time in their gender identity, even in unsafe and unsupportive environments. The goal behind these requirements was to ensure proper treatment, but in reality, they created delays, increased emotional distress, and restricted access, especially for marginalized groups. Today, many places have shifted to what's called the informed consent model, where individuals can access care by providing information agreement rather than going through psychological screening. This model caters to autonomy and respects individuals' rights to make decisions about their own bodies. However, even with this shift, barriers persist. For example, people in rural areas, people of color, or those without insurance still struggle to find supportive providers. So we have moved forward in theory, but the lived experience for many still involves obstacles shaped by geography, systemic inequality, and bias. I have a quote down there which talks about the goal of gender affirming care, which I think is really important to resonate with. So I'm gonna go over the structure, brain differences, and neurobiological correlations to gender identity. My research looks at how brain development may be linked to gender identity. Neuroscience studies have identified structural and functional differences in areas like the hypothalamus, amygdala, corpus callosum, and prefrontal cortex. These regions are involved in emotional processing, self awareness, and social behavior. What's fascinating is that fMRI studies often showed trans individuals exhibit neural activity patterns that align more closely with their gender identity than their assigned sex. For example, in some studies, trans women showed brain activity patterns similar to cisgender women. This matters because it adds biological support to trans and non binary identities. It challenges outdated ideas that gender identity is purely psychological or a choice. While this doesn't discount the role of environment and culture, it shows that there are neurobiological basis that needs to be acknowledged both in research and healthcare. I'm also going to go over the hormonal influences on brain development and identity. Hormonal influences play a major role in shaping brain development. This may be one of the biological components behind gender identity. During prenatal development, exposure to sex hormones like testosterone and estrogen help organize brain structures. Research suggests that the levels and timing of this exposure may affect how gender identity develops later in life. In childhood and adolescence, these hormones continue to shape neurological pathways, especially in areas related to emotional processing and social cognition. Later, in individuals undergoing hormonal replacement therapy, we see direct effects on the brain. For instance, studies show that trans women who take estrogen experience changes in the brain volume and connectivity, particularly in regions associated with whole body participation and self awareness. I'm going to go over the role of the environment and society and mental health of trans and non binary individuals. While biological factors like brain structure and hormones are important, the environmental context someone grows up in plays an equally powerful role in shaping their mental health, especially for trans and non binary individuals. On the left, we see a supportive environment. These individuals tend to experience affirmation from family, friends, and access to gender affirming care and, in- and inclusion in school and community spaces. This support is linked to lower rates of depression, anxiety, and suicidality. In contrast, people in a hostile environment may face rejection, bullying, or denial of care. These experiences lead to an increase in psychological distress, higher rates of mental health challenges. Even if someone has a strong biological foundation for their gender identity, chronic stress and stigma can severely undermine their mental well being. This directly supports my thesis that gender identity and mental health are shaped not just by what happens in the brain, but also what happens in society. Understanding both dimensions is a key to building a more inclusive and supportive future. This is about the impact of minority stress on mental health in trans and non binary. One of the most powerful frameworks for understanding mental health disparities in trans and non binary individuals is the minority stress model. This theory, rooted in social and cultural psychology, explains how people, when stigmatized, face chronic stress and that others don't. Stress takes two forms, internal and external. Internal stress includes things like internalized stigma, identity raised anxiety, and the fear of coming out. Even if someone knows who they are, they might carry shame or anxiety because of how society treats them. External stress refers to the world around. Things like discrimination in healthcare, being excluded in school and workplaces, or even experience verbal or physical violence. Both forms of stress feed into each other and have devastating impacts. Research consistently shows that higher rates of depression, anxiety, and self harm and suicidality in trans and non binary populations. And this isn't because of the identity itself, it's because of how society responds to that identity. In this project, I set out to answer a complex question. How do the structural and functional brain differences contribute to the mental health experiences associated with gender identity? Through my research, I found out this answer isn't one sided. Biological factors like hormone exposure and brain structure suggest that gender identity may have neurological roles. These findings are supported by the prenatal hormones and exposure and the fMRI brain scans and the effects of hormone replacement therapy. At the same time, environmental and social influence, such as family support, access to affirming care, and experiences with discrimination have a massive impact on mental health outcomes. The minority stress theory shows how stigma becomes internalized and chronic, leading to higher risks of anxiety, depression, and suicidality. When we put these together, it becomes clear. Gender identity is shaped by the intersection of the brain, body, and environment. Mental health disparities are not inherent to the identity, but a reflection of how society responds to it. This research shows that we need to treat gender diverse individuals with compassion, inclusivity, and evidence based care. This means recognizing the science, addressing the stigma, and ensuring access to support. Because only when we understand the whole picture, we can create a world where everyone, regardless of gender, can thrive. Thank you.
Let me remove the spotlight here for a minute. Thank you, Hasini. That was great. A couple of questions, and thank you for discussing why this topic was important to you. Um, I'm curious about a couple things. One is um, when you were mentioning some sort of study, I think it was like the FM something type of study, and you
Mhm.
were connecting kind of the biological markers with trans identity, and you explained that there are brain waves that would be similar in a transgender woman to a cis
Mhm.
woman, right? And in that study, um, where was that study from? I'm curious about that study, and how large was that study? Do you know?
I forgot where it's from. I could check my references, but it wasn't super large because when I was talking to my mentor, which by the way, it was Miss Jade, she was very nice. We were talking about how there wasn't a lot of research done on this, and it was really difficult for me to even like find research, or I was getting really creative with what I could find, and coming down to like my question, it was formed that way so I could find research. So I remember it wasn't that big.
Yeah, I mean, like that's a very interesting study because I would, and it seems like more studies like that could go a long way in this debate of public
Hmm.
opinion, right? That's certainly a study that would make sense. I'm wondering, did you come across there was like a Brown study, I want to say in like 2020, 2019, that tackled a lot of this. I don't know how public that study was, but I know it does exist. But I'm just wondering, did you come across a Brown study on
I
this?
didn't.
I'll see if I can find the article or
Okay.
the research because it's a good read. But I think it would be very germane for your topic, which I liked. I was also curious about one other thing. In the traditional forms of therapy, one of
Hmm.
the lines that you put in there was that they must live in the gender full time. I was confused about that.
Oh.
Was it the gender at birth or the gender identity that they had to live in full time while they were under assessment?
Well, yeah, so they would have to live under the gender, not the assigned gender, but the one they identify with full time. And that was an issue because at least back then there was more stigma, so they couldn't go to work or their family wouldn't accept it. So even though they wanted treatment and they couldn't live that way yet, they couldn't get it without like going through like judgment by society. So it put them through more distress.
Gotcha. Gotcha. And then for clarification on the environmental slide was how environmental factors impact mental health of TNB, right?
Yes.
Gotcha. Yeah, because the Brown study even they don't go into this as much, but they
Mm-hmm.
go into how environment helps shape TNB, right? How it
Okay, yeah,
so it's
that's
kind of it's because it talks about all of it, like biological factors, environmental factors, all that contribute to identity. What you're
mm-hmm.
saying in these environmental factors is the identity's already been determined. It's how the environment supports their mental health.
Yeah.
Got it. I enjoyed it. Thank you so much, Asini.